Welcome to the Wicked Podcast, where we discuss the business books you don't have the time for. I'm Marcus Kirsch.
And I'm Troy Norcross.
And we are your co-hosts for the Wicked Podcast.
We pick from the thousands of business books out there and test the author's ideas by comparing them to real-world challenges. With over 40 years of projects between us, we've got quite a bit to compare against.
We give you the condensed takeaways, followed by our interview with the author. We know you want actions, not theories, and it is actions that we want to help shape, because that's what the Wicked Podcast is all about.
So, Marcus, who have we got on the show today?
Yes, Troy. So today we will interview Richard Chataway, who's the Vice President of the BVA Nudge Unit UK and the founder of the Communication Science Group, CSG. He's one of the most experienced behavioral science practitioners in the UK for organizations, and he's the author of a book called The Behaviour Business. So we talked to him about understanding people's behavior and how that can be the best path forward into the future, in particular given our current situation here.
Yeah, I remember when I was reading this book, I read it basically in one long sitting, and there was so much great stuff in that book. I could talk to this guy for like a day.
Yeah, I was quite surprised when you said you had it basically done over the weekend. Same here. It's like, I don't know if it's still it will be in the interview, but I said to Richard, it's like two books in one. There's so much stuff in there, so many examples and case studies. It's a really good read, and I think there's something in it for everyone, which is a bit of a cliche line to say, but it's really true. There's just so much stuff in from different industries where you can really see the value of this behavioral science for organizations. It's brilliant. So what do you think our takeaways are?
So there are a lot of things I could take away from reading the book and from the great interview that we just had. I think one of the big ones for me was this real serious point. You don't need to have a degree in behavioral science to get started. Yes, you need to have certain behavioral skills, but the most important thing is to get started, regardless of the size of organization that you happen to be. And I think when I was working for a big pharmaceutical company, we only talked to 10 different users of the service, but we learned a huge amount from just 10 users. So the most important thing is A, start, and B, don't worry about having thousands and thousands of people. You can learn a huge amount from just 10.
Yeah, exactly. And I have the same attitude towards these new things. Some might sound very complex when you read them because they have a lot of terminology. It's the same with service design. When I was training people on service design at BT or over at HSBC, sometimes it can look very overwhelming when you show up with like 20 different tools. They all have their reason, they all have their value. So it's hard sometimes to pull back a little bit as a practitioner and understand when these things are new, they look like, oh my God, that sounds not just complex, but it sounds scary. It sounds like a massive investment and a massive risk, therefore. But oftentimes, those things can be done, quite in small steps. There's a lot of small, already quite effective things you can do that sometimes feel a bit obvious and common sense, but are not because likely you haven't done them before in your process. So, small steps forward, just getting one person in or just adding something to your process like that in terms of research is immensely valuable and absolutely doable tomorrow, which is a bit what we would talk to Richard about.
And I think just kind of piggybacking on that a bit, we talked very briefly about the appetite for risk. And, that's one of my bugbears. I talk a lot about how big companies tend to be very risk averse. But there are two extremes. The really, really large companies that have the ability and the confidence to take certain risks in their innovation departments. And they're really small companies, the startups, who inherently are trying different things and pivoting. At least the successful startups are, not all startups. And I think there's a huge middle ground where people are afraid to get in and learn something because it might break their business model or it might cause some level of change. And for them, change is risky.
Absolutely, yeah. Where startups have to prove something quite quickly, they're nearly forced to do so because if they can't confirm or proof of concept their first customers and that there's anything there that's accepted by the market, they'll die quickly. And the ones who do not do that, they're the ones that tend to die within the first couple of months of inception. And then the big ones, the companies, they have strategy departments or smart people sitting there going like, we should really be doing this, and they can they can lose $1 million or $2 million, and it's not gonna really scratch them. So, and they're used to also doing transformation and change all the time. It just depends on what they're changing or what they're bringing in. So bringing in something new like that is absolutely doable for them, and I think they're a little bit more used to it. They're also, on the other hand, as we probably both found, is sometimes these big organizations can have change fatigue, so people are just tired of another new thing to come into the office. But it's just then a matter of how you introduce that and how you show value that people can adopt it quite quickly. So the middle ground, as you rightly said, is that's the tricky part, where you have a business that's just about grew a bit, that's just about has business and revenue coming in, and then really risking taking an extra investment into something new that might or might not work, might be trickier for those type of businesses or size of businesses than others. Um, so what would you normally then say to a business like that?
Well, that kind of leads on to the second takeaway that I was talking about with you, which is understanding that Homer mode, as in Homer Simpson, versus Spock mode, as in Star Trek, applies not just to the customers of the company, but can also apply internally. And I think if you're going to start talking about how do we use behavioral science and how we're going to learn from and adapt our product or our service or our offering, we need to start remembering that we as people in the organizations are operating in Homer mode. Not everybody inside the organization is operating in a truly logical, rational thought process. There's a huge amount of emotions. There's a huge amount of emotional decision making or Homer mode decision making. And we as organizations and people like yourself and myself working with organizations need to help them understand that there are emotions driving the decision to or not to do behavioral science and studies and test tube studies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that comes down to, so Richard gave a good quote, I think, from the current CEO of Microsoft, who said something along the lines of, we need to change it from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture, which means that there's probably two sides to this, right? To really go and say, we need to learn every day a little bit more because the problem is too complex. So, that's sort of my side to the argument, saying, in a wicked problem world where things keep evolving, you have to keep learning. If you stop learning, you're basically not keeping up with what's going on today. But the tricky part there seems to be, and I've found that a lot in when organizational change is happening, that I think organizations understand that they don't fully understand the customer, and they need teams that understand the problem around the customer better. That's one thing. But the other thing I find sometimes missing to some extent is that leadership has to maybe communicate. I don't know how much they have accepted this. Maybe they have accepted it, but they don't communicate it always, that they actually are biased and don't know anything. So if they would start communicating that they're running on Homer mode, which is an odd thing to say if you're a very senior person in leadership and you get paid a lot of money to make the right decisions. But I think that trend seems to be changing. And we know that from when we talk to Sunny and to some of the other ones where, everyone says, who's been out there in management consulting, like, leaders should not be expected to make the decisions that much anymore. They should enable other people to get the insights and make the smart decisions or the iterative decisions, right? So that's sort of a trend we see, and I think maybe it can actually contribute to say, oh, we actually know we're all in Homer mode. We accepted the actual nature of how our brain actually works, and not this dream story of like, oh, we're all very logical and we're all thinking more about things than we think we do. We don't. Scientific evidence is there. So I really like that as an option to say, let's work on that maybe.
I mean, and that's a nice summary of how things are. And I love how we're bringing in more and more of the real world examples, like from companies like Microsoft. And also during the interview, we're talking not just in the enterprise level, we're talking about how these principles can apply at society level or in politics. So it was a really well-rounded interview.
Absolutely, because we covered ethics and so on and so on. But let's us stop bubbling around. Should we go to the interview then?
Yeah, but Marcus, I love these parts of our conversations. This is the part where we get to have the most fun. But you're right. Let's get on with the interview.
Cool, let's do it. Hello, Richard, and thank you for making time. We had a quite intense time reading your book because there's too much in it. And so we try to compress it so that we can fit some essential things into an hour, but it feels this will probably going to be quite a relevant one given our current context and our times, and not just the COVID, but a lot of other things that just been happening around the globe that are just so close to looking at people's behavior. So let me start by asking you, the idea of that humans are purely driven by logic has been quite debunked, and advertising and politicians are always trying to look at how we do things and predict and convince us of certain things. So can you tell us a little bit about what's behavioral science for organization, and sort of what's the difference to the other things that we sort of know that are out there? Can you explain it maybe a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I prefer to use the term, I suppose this is a kind of a semantic distinction to some degree. I prefer to use the term behavioral science rather than behavioral economics, which a lot of people might be familiar with, simply because to my mind, behavioral science is really an amalgamation of lots of different disciplines that give us new insights into how people behave and what drives people's behavior. And as you say, the key thing that we've learned, and one of the things I say in my book, is that we've learned more about human behavior in the last 50 years than we have in the previous 5,000. I mean, the discipline of psychology is barely over 100 years old. So it's actually really, in terms of what's driving human behavior, is relatively new. And there's lots we can learn from disciplines like behavioral economics, social psychology, even neurology and neuroscience to some degree, about how we make decisions in the real world and how that guides our behavior. And I think the key thing for me, and one of the reasons why I wrote my book, was that what we assume about human behavior and what drives human behavior is often erroneous, or at least misguided. And that's one of the key things that behavioral science tells us, is that people don't behave in a totally logical, rational fashion, as you've said. In most contexts, we're often very driven by environmental and contextual factors in terms of our behavior, and those things are often forgotten. And we all often assume that people are, very consistent or rational in the ways that they behave. And actually, what behavioral science tells us is that that's not the case, and that people are emotional. People are driven by how they think other people are behaving, social norms, and as well as those environmental and contextual factors. And those are things that we don't give enough credit to in terms of guiding our behavior, and we don't factor them in enough as to how we try and influence people. And in the business world, that's definitely true. And for me, one of the interesting things is that, having come from a public sector background where behavioral science and psychology has been used successfully in a number of different contexts for a number of years, we're not doing that enough, or systematically, in the business world. And there's loads we can learn from that about how to create better products and services, how to influence the behavior of our employees, and how to market those products and services better as well.
So when you look at that, then, because you said in an organizational context, and you talked about working in the public sector. A few months ago, we would have asked you how this works there. Now, maybe there's a lot of element to that where it's relevant towards what's been happening around COVID-19. So, where and how can a nudge team help? And if you can give us maybe some concrete examples of maybe what you've done and how you've done that, let's say around the HMRC tax notice, or you dealt a lot with healthcare and worked in that area, and how you also balance these things between what an organization and maybe the public sector is doing, and what also the capitalist side of it is, that probably sometimes contradicting when you talk about, one side wants to help you eat more healthy, and the other side goes, oh, I want to sell more burgers. Sort of, can you give us some concrete examples, maybe how those dynamics work?
Yeah, sure. So
do this.
Yeah, so I guess in the context of COVID-19, there's we're trying to encourage a lot of behaviours from people that are some degree, or obviously hugely different to how we're used to behaving. We're not used to having to stay 2 meters apart or 1 meter apart from each other, and socially distance, or we're not used to not being able to go out to restaurants and bars and so on. And the core of the work that we do at BVA Nudge Unit, but also the work that I've done in the past when I've been working for governments in the UK and Australia around healthy behaviours and addressing public health, is that in most cases people actually want to behave in a way that benefits them and benefits their health, and helps them lead longer and healthy lives. And that's as true of COVID-19 as is with issues like obesity or smoking and so on. But because we know that people are slightly irrational beings, that we are driven by emotional and non-conscious factors that influence our behaviour, that means that we struggle to do that sometimes. We'd all like to be a bit healthier, we'd all like to exercise more, we'd all like to eat more healthily, and yet we struggle to do so because maybe we don't have the willpower, or some of those contextual drivers are too strong. So that that's common across the work that we do. And the way we seek to influence behaviour in that way is to frame the choices in a way that the beneficial behaviour is more attractive and appeals more to some of those subconscious or what we might call system 1 factors. So to give you an example, I worked with the government in Australia, and we were working on smoking and encouraging people to quit smoking. As a big public health issue, single largest preventable cause of death in Australia, as it is in most parts of the world, is smoking-related illnesses. So, but the thing is, when you speak to smokers, when you ask smokers about their habit, everyone knows that smoking is bad for them. 97% of smokers are aware that it's detrimental to their health. So the battle has been won in terms of persuading people to quit, to be honest. But what most people struggle with is actually the act of quitting and actually staying off cigarettes, because smoking is addictive. It's it's chemically addictive, but there's also a very strong habitual element to it, which means that people, it forms a part of everyone's daily lives, and they struggle to move away from that. And that's why, for example, more recently, products like e-cigarettes have been quite successful in vaping, is because it's mimicking the same habit. It's just obviously replacing the product. But this was back in 2012 when I was working with the Australian government, before these products were available. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to use technology and facilitate people to quit and help them quit more successfully. And at that time, apps was relatively, mobile apps were relatively new technology. But the insight that drove us to develop that as an app called My Quit Buddy to help people quit wasn't that there was a new piece of technology available. The insight that drove it was, what's the barrier to people quitting successfully? Well, the barrier is that people need to have something to do when cravings hit. They can happen at any time of the day or night, and that's what gets people to reach for their cigarettes. We need to effectively provide a substitute, something else that they can reach for, something else that's in arm's reach, that can give them the necessary motivation, willpower, and support to help them with quitting smoking. And what's the one thing that everyone has within arm's reach 24 hours a day? Is their mobile phone. So a mobile solution was the best possible solution for that, and that was driven by an understanding of the behaviour and the behavioural insight. So and then when we made the app, what we incorporated into that was a number of different behavioural nudges to encourage people and help them with staying off cigarettes and staying quit from smoking. So things like, there were social norms elements to it, where you could have messages from your loved ones saying, keep going, you're quitting for us, your kids, or whatever it might be. There was also a kind of community element to it, so people could send each other messages of support. There was, every time you open the app, you got salient information on how much money you'd saved, how much tar you'd avoided in toxic chemicals, which was reinforcing the behaviour. And it proved to be very successful, and the app is still going strong 8 years later. It's had over 500,000 smokers in Australia have used the app, which is between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4, and the quitting success rates from using it are 8 times what you'd get from just quitting cold turkey. So, and for me, the other interesting insight about that, as about a solution, was that the app is still, as I say, working very successfully 8 years later, because we've been able to continually optimize it and update it by using data and feedback from users, which very much mirrors the way that the technological world works in terms of the kind of minimum viable product approach, and releasing continuous updates to improve the functionality of technology. But also, that's a great way to use behavioural insights, is to continually test, learn, and adapt. And that was one of the kind of key insights behind my book. So I guess to bring it back to that question about, how you square the circle in terms of, there are these influential factors within any kind of free market economy which are nudging us towards unhealthy behaviours, like smoking, drinking, unhealthy foods. But there are also, governments who are trying to influence behaviour towards healthy lifestyle, for example. And in the same way with COVID-19, we're trying to influence behaviour towards, staying at home, not gathering in groups, not, maintaining social distancing. There are always going to be those competing forces. And I would say in the context of things like fast food and obesity, it's an arms race. And to be honest, the McDonald's and the Burger Kings of this world have far more resources at their disposal than governments do, both financially and in terms of, the influence that they have on particularly younger people. In the case of COVID-19, I think one of the things that's reassuring is that, the competing influences have until recently not been very strong. As in, when here in the UK, the initial government message, which was stay at home, was very clear. People generally abided by it, and it was actually pretty remarkable, to be honest, actually how few people were not obeying by those restrictions. What we're starting to see now is obviously that more and more people are not obeying it. There are arguments being made, particularly in countries like the US, about how it's a restriction on civil liberties and freedoms, and then it becomes more challenging because there's a bit of sort of dissonance there going on amongst the population, where people are realizing that actually, some of their fundamental beliefs around how they should be allowed to lead their lives are being contradicted by how they're being forced to lead their lives. And then it's I would argue you're getting out of the territory of nudging, because ultimately you do reach a point where actually you may have to compel people to behave in certain ways for their own safety, and that's a different challenge. But I would say, sorry, go on.
You use the word dissonance, and I was going to bring up the word kind of cognitive dissonance, and that happens a lot when people are conflicted with what they should do or what they want to do, and how those two things sometimes don't align. And I think that whether it's the fast food industry with their billions trying to say consume our products, of course we don't want you to consume too much because we know that's unhealthy, and the government coming out with, here, have some fruit, here, this is a heart disease, this is high blood pressure, this is cardiovascular. All of these things can be fixed with just improving your diet slightly. And does that conflict of messages you're being bombarded with, cause, internal stress in the individuals?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think, I mean, undoubtedly it does to some degree, because, as I say, I think we all know that we could lead, or we want to lead healthier lives. We want to ensure, that we live life to the fullest, and are able to that none of us want to die prematurely. So it does create stress for people, and it's interesting, I think, some research you see about, well, I would say, as anecdotally, when I go into McDonald's, I don't see a lot of happy faces, and
Okay.
I think that's because, to some degree, people realise that obviously it's not necessarily the best choice for them lifestyle-wise. So, I think there is a stress to that. But I guess this is one of the beauties of the work that we do in terms of nudging behaviours, is that it's entirely consistent with the philosophy and beliefs of a free market democratic system, which is that people are free to behave in the ways that they choose, so long as it does not harm other people. And what we are doing in with nudging behavior is we are framing choices in ways that benefit those individuals. But the fundamental principle, and this is one of the argument I make whenever people ask me about the ethics of nudging, is to say you still have the choice to behave as you wish. You still have the choice to go to McDonald's. You still have the choice to to smoke. But it's important from the point of view of maintaining and providing the best possible outcomes for citizens within a society, that those choices are framed in a way that is informative and ensures that the choices that we make are going to benefit us. And and some people argue about, from an ethical viewpoint, about, well, who are you to choose what's beneficial for individuals? If people want to smoke themselves to death, they should be allowed to. I say
And I
absolutely, you still can do that, but the problem is, as I say, 97% of smokers at any point say, I really wish I didn't smoke. So, it's incumbent on us as a society to facilitate that behaviour when the thing that you're battling against is a chemically addictive product that's marketed in a insidious way to encourage people to use it. So that's the I think the benefit of nudging is that people are still free to choose and behave in the way that they want. What we're just doing is trying to nudge them into behaviours that are beneficial to them and ones which actually they would want to adopt themselves.
So going back to your book, and I loved the ideas of Homer mode versus Spock mode, and the idea of making conscious decisions almost implies it's more Spock mode. It's the cognitive. Okay, I've got choice A, choice B. I'm going to choose B, as opposed to the kind of the Homer mode, which is the non-engaging brain and just kind of following along with some level of intuition. And if you bring that back into the organizational thing, this is where Marcus and I spend a lot of our time, is working with enterprises and enterprise teams. And yes, it could be that the marketing department understands that most of the decisions that are made by their end customers are in Homer mode. But how do you communicate Homer mode versus Spock mode to the engineering department, to the finance department, to the executive team?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it is a big challenge, because I think there's a couple of things that are that are challenging around this. One is that, as you say, it's generally true that I think people in those kind of teams, particularly engineering teams, I would say, without wishing to stereotype, are quite logical in their thinking a lot of the time and their way to problem solving, and so wouldn't necessarily recognise that the consumers they're dealing with, but also their own decisions, might be more instinctive and driven by some of these biases and heuristics that we have when we're in that Homer mode, than they realise. And then also, that the other challenge is that by necessity, if you're working for in an organisation, you are thinking much more deeply about the problems that organisation faces than people outside the organisation are thinking about them. So, if you think about it in terms of, as consumers, when we go into a supermarket and we are making a choice about what brand of shampoo to buy, for example, that's not a decision that anyone thinks about in a huge amount of detail and a huge amount of depth, because frankly, we've all got better things to do with our time. But the people who work for those shampoo brands are making the assumption of making very deep, considered decisions about the way that brand is marketed, the way where it sits on the shelf, where what color the packaging is, and they should be doing that, recognizing that actually the heuristics that the consumer is using when they're making that purchase in the supermarket will be very instinctive and largely Homer-like. But because you're breathing that brand every day for 7 or 8 hours, it's difficult to put yourself in those shoes and to think about it in that kind of less rational way. And typically the kind of processes and systems and organizational structures within a business reward logic and reason in the way that we approach decisions, and therefore that's the challenge, I guess. So to my mind, I guess the way to address that is firstly to recognize that a lot of the decisions that people are making about the products and services that you develop will be largely driven by that Homer mode, and people will be in that more instinctive mode. But the way to get an understanding of that and understanding those decisions is really to test it, and ideally test stuff in the real world. And this is where some of the examples that I use in my book around the likes of Google and Amazon and Netflix, and the way they built their products and services is entirely built on that. So there's an example in the book about Amazon and Amazon Prime, So, I'm sure you and your listeners are probably familiar with Amazon Prime. It's their subscription-based product. You pay a monthly fee and you get free delivery for however many items you purchase from Amazon. Now, before Amazon introduced Amazon Prime, they conducted a big econometric modeling project. So they basically went out, they got some econometricians to do some modeling to see whether it was going to be profitable for them. And the econometric modeling predicted it would be a massive failure and would cost them millions of dollars a year. But credit to Amazon, they thought, well, okay, that's one piece of data, if you like, about the effectiveness of this. Why don't we actually just test it with a subset of our users and find out if we think it's effective and or it's going to work in the real world? And so what they did was they introduced Amazon Prime to a small subset of Amazon customers, and in the first year, it wasn't profitable for them. It cost them money. But actually what they found was it drove a much more loyalty amongst those customers. And in fact, those customers who were on Amazon Prime in the US spent nearly twice as much a year and visiting the site nearly twice as often. So they weren't spending more per visit. They were just spending more overall and visiting Amazon more often and become more loyal. We're using Amazon to buy a wider range of products than they had been previously. And effectively, it became massively profitable. It's obviously now been rolled out globally as part of their offering. And I think, that's really interesting for me on two levels. One is that, the modeling that had been had a number of assumptions built into it proved to be incorrect. But the other is it just shows the value of conducting real world tests and real world testing amongst users, because when there are these biases and heuristics and system one processes at play, often the only way you can get a good read on that is to actually recreate the context of the decision and get people to, and try it out in the real world.
Well, so my background is design, in particular at the moment. Service design is a thing. So human centricity, human-centered research, not too far away from what you're doing. Maybe less rigid, but it does the same thing. Like it looks to really prove, that behaviors and things are actually happening in the real world, rather than assuming that certain things are there. And it goes a lot into the qualitative, soft, emotional aspect of it. Now, the biggest challenge there, and I worked on a big project at BT, HSBC nationwide, where they talked about customer centricity a lot. But the challenge there, in some kind of nutshell, I guess, would be that it was really hard for them to commit to it, because they still measured what they were previously measuring. They weren't measuring what they should be measuring. And that drove prioritization, right? So if they don't measure what they should be measuring, if they don't measure the new, then the results will not come back to prove them wrong. The results will come back to prove them right by saying, it's probably not going to work. And our design is just fluff. And we can't just focus just on the customer, because the business needs to survive. So the business needs to have a relevancy and a value creation on that side. Tell me a little bit about what challenges you found in exactly that, when you come in with something that's still in a lot of organizations pretty new, to say, hey, hang on a second, this actually is a value. You're just not measuring it yet. But actually there is a massive amount. Can you give me time to prove that it works, hope that it works in this particular case? And like, for example, like we prove over at BT, we had 2 of the 3 pilot projects we had and actually run proper research. We had to pivot them because the assumptions were totally wrong. We saved them millions in investment to fix the real problem. If you're given the time, that's great. But what's your experience sort of in being in organizations and telling that story, to say, I'm the new kid on the block. What's the new measurement? Can you adopt that? Can you give me time to do that? What's your experience there?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, because I think, you're absolutely right that to some degree, a lot of the work that we do does require looking at different metrics, or not necessarily looking at different metrics, but actually just being very focused on one metric, I think is the key thing. And the opening line of my book is, if you're in business, you're in the business of behavior. And what I mean by that is that any business needs to influence behavior to succeed. If you're not influencing behavior, in some way, shape, or form, whether that's influencing people to buy your products and services or influencing the behavior of people who work within your organization, then it's wasted effort. Because one of the key things that behavioral science tells us is that there is a difference between our attitudes and our behavior a lot of the time, and simply influencing attitudes is not enough necessarily to get people to then subsequently behave in the way that you want, or to change their behavior. So and if people aren't behaving, if the people aren't buying your products and services, which is a behavior, then you're not going to generate any revenue. So and so for me, one of the really useful aspects of thinking of problems in this way and using behavioral science and applying behavioral science is that it encourages you to focus on the metrics that relate to behavior. So at a really fundamental level, if you're working on with a digital on a digital product, the behavior you want is you want people to click on a certain part of the site, or you want people to to make a purchase and complete a purchase, and that should be the only metric that counts. And how you get to that could be all sorts of different ways. So to give you an example, we were working with a credit card provider. They were very successful from a marketing viewpoint at driving people to their website with the intention of applying for a card. But what was happening was people were landing on the site, and then very few people were actually completing an application or even starting an application for the card. And they asked us to take a look at the site, and we took a look at the site, and what immediately leapt out was before you even saw the apply online button to click, you had to scroll through 3 pages of product features and benefits and key terms and conditions before you even saw that button. Now, from a behavioral viewpoint, that's a really bad experience, because one of the things that we know and what's been demonstrated countless times is that the more cognitively easy you can make something for someone, the less thinking power or thinking time you require of people to behave in a certain way, recognizing they're often in that system 1 Homer-like mode. We are generally lazy in our thinking a lot of the time. Then the less likely they are to behave in the way that you want. So making people assess and read all of this information before starting an application was just an additional barrier to the behavior, and wasn't getting people to click on the button. So very simple changes that we recommended were move the button above the fold on the site, change the color, change the wording of it, made it as salient as possible, and that instantly increased the percentage of people clicking through to make an application by 54%. Now, that change in design terms was a relatively small one, relatively inexpensive one, but in terms of the profitability it delivered to the business, it was huge. But the only metric we needed to have in place to measure the impact of that was click-through rate, and looking at how many people were actually clicking on that button. And we assessed that with a simple A/B test of the old website versus the new website. And so, I think if you are single-minded, if you are focused on, we have a behavioural objective, which is to get people to do A rather than B, then that determines the metrics that you assess around that, because the metric should just be that behaviour. And other metrics, can be useful and instructive, but that's the end goal, and that's what you're aiming towards. And that's where I've seen the value of this, really, to be honest. And a lot of what happens within organisations and businesses in particular is that a lot of metrics are constructed in order to some degree allow people to take defensive positions around decisions that they've made. We've increased the numbers of X by Y%, therefore we've been successful. But actually, in terms of what that relates to in terms of your bottom line and the value it delivers to the business, that's often really difficult to define. But if you've got a behavioural metric, which is, as I say, in that particular case, getting people to do an application was directly contributed to the revenue generated by that product, then you can demonstrate effectiveness much more easily.
In 2006, I was working with a company called E-Consultancy back in the day. And there was a study that was done on a particular airline's website. And they always kind of gave you the first choice being, where do you want to travel from? And the second choice drop-down box, where do you want to go to? And the interesting insight was if they flipped those two boxes, they increased overall sales by something like 23%. Because most people, when they arrive at a travel site, are thinking, I'm going to go to Mallorca.
Right,
I don't
yeah.
care whether I go from Gatwick or whether I go from Luton. I want to go to Mallorca. And that one little change made huge difference. And I thought that was a similar interesting approach.
Yeah, it's absolutely, yeah. That I love that kind of stuff because it's firstly it's something that's a bit counterintuitive, which is what behavioral science tells us. And the second thing is, the only way you could really assess that was by making that change and testing it. And I think that's what the real value of this approach. Some of the examples I talk about in the book, and again, from looking at some of the most successful 21st century businesses, that's been integrated into their approach, has been testing every variable from that could have an impact on the desired behavior to ascertain effectiveness. So, Google tested the color blue that you get your Google search results in. They tested that amongst 40 different Pantones of blue alone to find out what that had. And that delivered an incremental $200 million of revenue just by changing the color blue that they used for showing your search results, which is astonishing when you think about it. That should have that level of impact, but that is the value and the benefit of the approach is that if you, and I guess this is the other aspect of that's really critical that I talk about in the book, is that the phrase I use is test tube behaviors, and by that I mean it's firstly that you're using the science and using the evidence base around how people behave and the latest thinking around that. But the other is that you're willing to experiment and you're willing to adopt a kind of growth mindset in terms of going, okay, we maybe don't have all the answers here. Let's test out some new things, some hypotheses to find what works, because you'll often find exactly the example you gave, something that's really surprising and really counterintuitive, but delivers a significant business advantage. And Rory Sutherland, who wrote the foreword to my book, he has a great phrase, which is, test counterintuitive things because your competitors won't. If you're finding something counterintuitive, that's a competitive advantage to you because other people aren't doing it. And that's the real value of what we do in applying behavioral science. And those examples I love because they're obvious when you think about them, but at the time, obviously, previously, no one had ever thought about it.
I'm sure you've heard Rory's famous story about increasing the speed from King's Cross to the Channel and the cost associated with it, as opposed to putting scantily clad people on the trains, working in the trains, and adding more consumer value. It's one of my favorite stories that he's told.
Absolutely. And people would, as he said, people would ask for the train to be slowed down. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Very counterintuitive, but it works.
And that's to your point about working with engineers. Making the trains faster is an engineering solution to the problem, whereas making the experience of traveling on that train more pleasant instead for a fraction of the cost is very much a behavioral solution.
So that leads me nicely into my next question, which is there is at least one budget airline who I will not name out specifically, but we all know who we're talking about, whose CEO has described passengers as nothing more than self-loading cargo, and has been doing behavioral experiences repeatedly on exactly how bad of a customer experience can I make it and still have customers. So we've been talking about how can you make things better. Do you also see sometimes people looking to increase profitability, drive shareholder value at the expense of, the customer experience, at the expense of the employee experience, using behavioral science in the same way?
Yeah, it's those case studies are fascinating, I think, because it to a certain degree it's about the expectations that you create, and I do think it's in the case of that particular airline, there's definitely a calculated element to it, which is if I'm very transparent and honest about the fact that I really don't care how bad the experience is for the customers, then you've created an expectation. And people travel on that airline very clear in their reason for traveling on it, which is that it's cheap and that they don't have any expectations of any kind of quality of customer experience as a result of that. And in a way, it's kind of, in behavioral science, we talk quite a lot about anchoring, which is where, you can give people an arbitrary number and then their subsequent valuations of a product or service, for example, will be influenced by that. So, it's why, for example, in a restaurant, the wine menus will have ridiculously expensive bottles of wine at £2,000 or £3,000 or something like that. It's not because there are some people who will occasionally buy bottles of that value, but what it does is it makes all the other bottles of wine on the menu look like better value because you've got that high price anchor there. And it kind of works in reverse, I think, there where they're basically saying, look, the pricing is really low, and they're creating that expectation, that anchor around it by saying, it's low, but that means that, frankly, you're going to have terrible service. And he's just reinforcing that image. And therefore creates that expectation. And if you think about it as well, if anything that airline does, which incrementally adds to the quality of your customer experience, or even to the extent of the people working on the airline smile at you,
Mm-hmm.
they don't look like it's a terrible place to work, you're suddenly like, okay, maybe it's not as bad as I thought. So I think there's an element of, there is a behavioural element to that, which is that by being very clear that the only reason you're using them is because they're cheap, and that they don't really have any concern about the quality of customer experience, they set the bar really low in terms of what they actually have to deliver. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily it's a very risky strategy, if you ask me, but I think there's an element to that. And one of the things I always find interesting about, I think it's the same airline that you're thinking of, is that when the plane lands and it's on time, they play a little trumpet sound, like kind of thing.
Jesus.
And that's hilarious at one level, because it's kind of implying, oh, you arrived safely, that's a result, which is the minimum I would expect of any airline, really, is to actually get me to my destination. But it's a really interesting example, I think, of how they're kind of setting those expectations in a slightly different way. And and most airlines obviously will spend millions of dollars every year trying to communicate, what a high quality of customer experience they create. The challenge with that is if you don't then deliver on that, and this is what a lot of the work that I do is based around, is about ensuring good quality experiences for people. Then people get very angry about it, and it generates a very kind of system one emotional response to it.
Yeah, it seems to be generally sort of an odd, nearly opposing kind of powers that be within organizations when still a lot of business schools are basically teaching that if you're a company, you want to run a company professionally successfully, you got a product, you sell it, you got level of margin on it, and if actually anyone buys it, that's great. The next thing to do to grow the business, or either sell more, but you make the product shittier, right? So you try to produce it with cheaper materials and whatever, save costs when you produce the same product or experience. And that's what a lot of schools are still teaching. That's a normal go-to place. So very few companies like Apple, for example, do the opposite, but then they already sit nearly in the luxury experience level as a company rather than in the normal one. It's like Dell. Dell is selling computers as cheap computers, not as higher performance quality, right?
Yeah.
So, the thing I'm trying to get to is, customer centricity. It's a good thing. We all know it. It actually has a immense value. It can turn companies around. If I would start to use behavioral science in a team tomorrow, and I already have marketing efforts, strategy teams, where would I start? How would that look like? How would day one look like? And, what's sort of your experience and where this would be placed right for someone to do that? Especially with COVID-19, this stuff sounds so compelling to actually understand reality way better than anybody else. I want to do this. How am I going to do that next week?
And to add to that, before you answer, you made a really good quote in the book that I wanted to pull out. You don't need to have a degree in behavioral science to do it. So not only where
Yes.
would you start, but what are the skills of the people you'd put in?
Yeah, so to my mind, where it works most effectively, or where I've seen it applied most, well, I think there's two things you need. One is mindset related, and one is skills related. So mindset wise, it goes back to that point about the kind of growth mindset and recognizing that you don't know there are things that you don't know as an organization. I thought it was really interesting recently that Satya Nadella, when he was asked about the transformation that Microsoft has gone through in the last few years, and he said he attributes it to moving from a know-it-all culture to a learn-it-all culture. I thought that was a really nice way of putting it. In that, what as we've discussed, one of the things that behavioral science tells us is that sometimes the solutions to problems can be slightly counterintuitive. They're based in some of the irrationalities of human behavior. So you have to recognize that if someone, to your example about pricing, if someone says to you, or the traditional kind of MBA based approach would be, reduce costs to increase your margin. If someone said to you, well, actually, why don't we just put the price up and then we might sell more? That sounds mad to someone with a kind of very traditional neoclassical economic educational background. But what behavioral science tells us is that actually, yes, by increasing the price of a product, it's communicating a whole load of subconscious associations which might actually increase your sales. Because there is a broad heuristic we have that higher price equals better quality. So there's that side to it, which is recognizing, as I say, as a mind in any organization, if you're going to apply behavioral science successfully, you have to recognize that actually testing and learning and some of your received assumptions about what's driving the behavior of either your customers or your staff may not be right. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing, does come down to that skill set, and where I've seen, when I say you don't need a degree in behavioral science, I mean, I guess there's a slight element of a self-serving element to that, which is that, when I was at university 20 odd years ago, it didn't exist as a discipline, so it wasn't an option to me to study it in any case. But it's more that, obviously, I would say work with experts like ourselves and other behavioural consultancy businesses or behavioural scientists is a good way to start, because the discipline is growing very fast. There's been over 200 different biases and heuristics identified in research. So actually having the knowledge base of all of those, does take time. There's no easy fix to that. But the other aspect is that where it works most effectively is that combination really of if you want subject specialism and experience in application in particular areas. And what's been really heartening for me about some of the work that we've done and that I talk about in the book is that, where many of the best results and outcomes that I describe in the book have come from was working with people in specialist areas that I knew nothing about, but because of their specialist knowledge combined with behavioral science, we were able to work more successfully. So to give you an example, one of the projects I describe in the book was working with a major bank here in the UK with 20 million plus customers. We were working with their call center, their contact center, and we were incorporating behavioral nudges into the language and scripting that was used in that call center when talking to customers to improve the outcomes for customers in terms of customer service, but actually overall to reduce the length of the calls to deliver an efficiency saving for them. And actually, what's interesting about that was that by making the call shorter, we were actually delivering a better customer experience because, and this goes back to the point about Homer versus Spock, what people want from a call to their bank is they want it to be short. They want to get in and get out and get their query resolved as quickly as possible and get on with the rest of the day. So the shorter we can make calls whilst also making them successful and the outcome successful, the better the customer experience for people. But that's obviously beneficial to the bank as well, because the shorter the calls, the more calls you can handle and the greater capacity you have. But my point is that when it came to designing the solutions and the scripting solutions, what we were able to do was to say, well, look, best practice behavioral science and existing experiments have shown that if you do X, then Y should result. But what we did was we worked with the people in the call center, we worked with the coaches, and we worked with the individual call center agents to create those scripts, because they had been talking, some of them had been working there for 20, 30 years. So they had some degree of knowledge and experience about what worked in terms of talking to customers and what delivered a better outcome for customers. So we were supplying the knowledge and the evidence base, and they would go, okay, well, I know that if you frame it in this way, if you use this language, it's going to be much more successful, but either because it's easier for us to say or the customers are more likely to understand it, and so on. So that's, I think what I would say is that yes, absolutely, you need the expertise, you need the knowledge base, but also don't forget that a lot of the insights that you can get may be things that already exist within your organization. You've just got to unlock them. Amos Tversky, who is one of the godfathers of behavioral economics, who was the academic partner of Daniel Kahneman for many years, who Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize, and Amos Tversky would have won it, but unfortunately passed away a few years before. He always says all we're doing with behavioral economics is we're giving evidence to things that advertisers and used car salesmen have known for many years, which I think is a really nice way of putting it, in that there are people out there working in certain industries and contexts who are using a lot of these principles and recognizing the biases and heuristics that humans have, but just aren't aware of how they're doing it or what the evidence base is for that, so they can't necessarily replicate it or scale it. And that's where we can help.
And that's really nicely put, that there are a lot of people that intuitively are doing these things without necessarily knowing that they're doing them.
Yeah.
One of the other questions that we wanted to bring up, because a lot of people that we work with, at the enterprise level and the organizational level, for lack of a better phrase, are risk averse. The word failure is a dirty, awful, horrible word. And yet to do all of this testing, at the end of the day, some tests are going to succeed and some are not. Can you talk a bit about what RCTs are, as you reference them in the book, and how do you kind of get the organizational mindset to be okay with learning what doesn't work?
Yeah, so I mean, and that is a really big challenge, and something that it's common to a lot of organisations, particularly larger organisations. And I think that's one of the reasons why the examples that I use in the book and the reference I make to the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, and Google, and some of the more successful digital 21st century businesses, because from day one, what's been baked into their culture is recognizing that testing and learning and accepting failure is really important, and that's, I would argue, is what's driven their success as much as if not more so than technological innovation. And I think it tends to be the larger, more traditional organizations where, like you say, failure is a dirty word. And the reason, and defensive decision making is a key feature of most organisations. People rely on their work to provide them with their livelihoods and their homes. So that risk of failing and losing those things is very real, and we know that loss aversion is a really big driver of human behaviour in behavioural science. So that's why it is a challenge, and I think the way I would approach it is, firstly, as I say, to use the analogy and use examples from those most successful 21st century businesses. That the likes of Jeff Bezos, love him or hate him, he does say that Amazon's success is a feature of, or is a function rather, of how many experiments they run per day, per week, per month, per year. And so he recognizes by doing that a lot of the experiments, if not the majority of experiments that they conduct, will fail. And that's the nature of scientific progress, is that the majority of times you do the experiment, it fails, but you only need one or two big wins. You only need one Amazon Prime to more than compensate for all of those failures if you're testing in a relatively inexpensive, quick and easy way. And I guess that's a key point to mention about. So you asked about RCTs. RCTs, randomized control trials, is a methodology that we'll probably be reading about quite a lot in the next few months, I would imagine, in relation to COVID-19, because it's derived from medical science, which is that it's how you test new drugs and new treatments. So you have a group of a control group who are, typically in a medical context would be given a placebo, so they're receiving no treatment or no treatment different to what they're currently receiving. And then you have other groups who are given the new treatments, and you assess the outcomes for the control group versus the treatment groups to see how effective that medicine is. And the way we use that in behavioral science is that we would have a group who receive no, or in a communications context, for example, if we're working in a call center, you have a group of agents in the call center who carry on as they were before using the existing scripts, and then we would have test scripts that are used with different groups in the call center, and you look at the outcomes of the calls versus the control group versus the other groups where you're testing. And that's a gold standard for experimentation because it gives you robust data. If you gather enough data, you can make sure that the p-scores in terms of statistical significance are high enough that you can say this outcome was delivered as a result of our intervention rather than any number of other factors you can control for the other factors. And that is the gold standard. But the trouble with it is that it's often expensive. It often takes time to get to those levels of statistical significance. It can take a while. I would say, an exception to that is the digital world where, if you are a Google, you've got so many thousands of users that actually getting to statistical significance quite quickly is relatively easy to do. But for a lot of businesses and more traditional organizations, it's harder. But I would say that doesn't negate the value of that experimental approach. And actually, conducting experiments is really valuable for, not only for all the reasons I've mentioned around it's how we assess the effectiveness of behavioral science, behavioral interventions. It's also really valuable because even if you do get a failure, even if your experiment doesn't work, that's a useful learning. It's a useful insight. It's how we make progress in science. Is because if you found that something doesn't work, you know that you should never do that thing. And the next time there's a meeting where someone goes, "Oh, okay, maybe we should try this thing," you can say, "Actually, we have some data on that. It didn't work." But
Oh no, but hold on. Don't go racing by that one particular point. The number of people who come into an organization who want to put their mark on an organization and they say, we're going to try X, Y, Z. And somebody in the back of the room says, yeah, well, Karen tried that 2 years ago and it didn't work.
Yeah, and I do have an example.
That's in the book, isn't it?
But I'm not Karen. I'll get a different result. And I'm like, you're not listening. This didn't work.
Yeah, so I think there is an example. I was aware, even though I was saying it, that there's an example I use in my book of when I was working in the Department of Health, where there was a meeting where I suggested trying something, and someone said, "Oh, we tried that in 1982 and it didn't work." And I can tell you that was pretty much the precise moment I decided I need to get out of the public sector at that point. But it was, but that's an example, I guess, an example of what I would call a fixed mindset rather than the growth mindset in terms of someone not being willing to embrace new thinking and so on. But it's so absolutely that is a barrier. But the value of experimentation is you can confidently say in a meeting that we've tried something and either it worked or it didn't. But I think the other point I would make about sort of embracing failure is that when we conduct behavioral experiments, we're not typically testing one thing. We're typically testing multiple things.
Right.
And that's why randomized control trials are valuable, for example, because you can test multiple interventions simultaneously and assess them against each other. And what you'll typically find, and certainly the pattern that we usually find from those experiments, is that you find, say you're testing 5 interventions, you might find 2 work really well, better than your control. You might find a couple don't work, or maybe you can't prove statistical significance, but there might have been a small uplift. And you typically find at least one actually is worse than the control. But the thing is that you can never tell beforehand. We've done things with places where I've worked where we've had bets between us as to what we think is going to work and what isn't, and people's opinions vary, and typically, often it's very rare that anyone is right. So just goes to show the value of testing, because you can't make assumptions. But the other is that that thing that didn't work is still a really valuable insight, because you can say we should never do that. And what you might also find is, of the 4 interventions that did work, if you put them together in some combination, or that they can complement each other, the uplift you can achieve could be really, really huge. So I think that's the importance of testing. And also, I'd say, to your point about new people coming into an organization, we know these things are very context dependent. So if someone's come in from another organization and says, "Oh, we did this at company X, I think it can work here," my response to that would be to say, absolutely, it may work here, but let's test it to find out, because this is a different product, this is a different context, and we need to assess whether it actually works in this context. And I've seen countless examples of nudges that we've employed that have worked in one place, and then we've tried them almost identically in a different context, and it hasn't worked.
Yeah,
Which just to show it's the importance of the context.
So I'm just looking at the time. So as a last question, probably to pull this a bit further out, because it's always fascinating for me to hear, and I've been going through different practices from design and coding and strategy and everything. If we look at something like a trend, where I tend to like to go and look at the difference between efficiency and effectiveness, and a lot of organizations are still trying to solve problems around efficiency, not effectiveness, which is a big mindset change, or not just a mindset change, an opportunity change, and actually understanding that. And if I pull this back also to obviously my favorite topic of the wicked problem, where back, Horst Rittel back in the 50s, 60s said, right, there's some problems out there. They're just so complex. They're moving targets, meaning that we'll never know enough about them. It seems to be there's more and more of those problems out there because we're more connected and other things are just affecting each other differently in this modern world. Would you say, because experimentation comes out a lot, is that sort of the only way to go, where basically we can't be stuck with just polishing what's already there? We have to always try for the new. It's just not an option anymore. It's experimentation. It's connect with the reality in 1,000 different ways, and really see what's out there, because we don't know what's out there in a month. Is that our only way forward? Is that, or is it just 50% of any organization, or is it what everyone should fully embrace, to really go out with as hard as they can in order to make some sense of this, interconnectedness, interdependency of every action you take these days? What's your view on that? If you
Yeah, well, I guess I would say, I think, well, the way I would put it is this: is that my experience has been is that often in organisations there is a bias towards not testing, as in to justify conducting tests and experiments, particularly based on behavioural insights, particularly if those behavioural insights are, as I say, slightly counterintuitive. Whoever the first person at Google to walk into a meeting and say, I think we should test 40 different Pantos a shade of blue to see what impact it has on click-through rate, I applaud them for having the bravery to do that. But also I applaud Google for being the kind of organization where they go, yeah, sure, let's test it. I would say there is a bias in most organizations to not testing, or assuming, to go back to the Satya Nadella example, assuming that we do know it all and that we don't have the need to experiment because there are some assumptions that we're making about our consumers, about our employees, that are givens of truths, if you like. And I would say, the bias should be the other way. The bias should be to test as much as you possibly can to gain those insights, rather than just fiddle around the edges and around the margins in terms of testing things. So one example I can give is that I worked in the media and advertising industry for a number of years, and particularly when I worked in media agencies, where media agencies are given budgets to spend on behalf of advertisers and make recommendations on which channels to use, how much to spend on TV versus radio versus digital, to advertise a particular product. The way it worked was a client would come to us and say, we've got £5 million. You build a plan, the most effective plan you think to spend that £5 million. There was never any context where we went back to the advertiser and said, we don't need 5 million, we can do the job for you for 3, because the incentives were lined up in a way where, we had to spend the £5 million, or we wanted to maximize our revenue. But also we never went back to that client and said, no, don't give us the 5 million now, give us 50,000. We'll run a few tests to find out which channel's most effective, and then we'll come back and tell you how to spend the other 4.95 million. And I think that for me is illustrative of the way that the biases in business decision making and organizations operate, in that the bias is away from testing to try and find out what works before you commit. And I think in a large part that's to do with the need to move quickly, the fact that everyone's always that there is a real emphasis on being first to market, for example, rather than challenging. And so that would be the way I'd frame it. So it's not necessarily that you have to test absolutely everything that you're doing, but I think my recommendation, and I guess the point of my book to some degree, is the emphasis should be that you should be biased towards testing unless there's a good reason not to, which is that would in most contexts will be okay. We've kind of got all the data we need on this to know to be at a degree of confidence that we know it's the right approach.
Yeah, I think that's a really good closing point there to make. I think treating most things rather as an assumption before they hit reality, we don't really know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's the basics of behavioral science, is that we are all biased in ways that we're not conscious of, and so what that means is that a lot of the assumptions that we're making have been informed by those biases, and because we're not conscious of them, you just have to assume that some of them aren't, or we can be safe in the assumption that not all of them are right.
Cool. We're a little bit restricted as well here ourselves, unfortunately, in time. As we discussed before the interview, maybe in the beginning, that there's so much in this book. An hour is super short. We tiny bit run over. Richard, for now, thank you so much. This was super insightful, very inspiring, and a great chat to have.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Enjoyed it.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Wicked Podcast, where we read the business books you don't have the time for. You can find all relevant links and a way to contact us in the description. And please like, share, and subscribe, and we hope we see you next time.